Donc, donc nous allons commencer aujourd'hui avec la présentation du professeur émérite Éric Papas. Éric Papas est professeur à la School Optometry and Vision Science de l'Université de Nouvelle-Galles du Sud à Sydney en Australie. Il a passé une grande partie de sa carrière dans la recherche liée à la surface oculaire et aux lentilles de contact. Il était auparavant directeur exécutif de la recherche et développement au Brian Holden Vision Institute. Connu comme l'un des inventeurs des hydrogels de silicone, il a également découvert le lien entre l'hyperémie limbique et l'oxygène. Il a été membre de plusieurs ateliers, TIFOS et DEWS2. Il a travaillé sur le dysfonctionnement des glandes de Meibomius, d'inconfort de lentilles de contact, pour lesquels il a présidé le sous-comité de gestion au niveau du TIFOS et du DEWS2. Et ces travaux publiés comptent plus de 100 articles et chapitres de livres, avec comité de lecture, bien sûr, qui ont été revus, ainsi que 12 brevets. Il est rédacteur en chef adjoint de Contact Lens and Anterior Eye et membre du comité de direction de Optometry and Vision Science et de Clinical and Experimental Optometry et aussi de Eye and Contact Lens. Il a reçu le prix Max Scapero de la section Cornea Contact Lenses and Refractive Technologies de l'American Academy of Optometry. Il a été reconnu par Contact Lens Spectrum, donc un journal de référence, comme étant l'une des 30 personnes les plus influentes dans le domaine des lentilles de contact. Donc, pour nos amis anglophones, for our friends who speak English and understand English, I will try to present Professor Éric Papas. Éric Papas is professor in the School of Optometry and Vision Sciences at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. He has spent much of his career in research related to the ocular surface and contact lenses, and was formerly executive director of R&D at the Brian Holden Vision Institute, known as one of the inventors of silicone hydrogen. He also discovered the link between limbal hyperemia and oxygen. He has been a member of several TIFOS workshops, and including DEWS2, meibomian gland dysfunction and contact lens discomfort, for which he chaired the management subcommittee. He's published works a number over 100 articles and chapters and book chapters, as well as 12 patents. He serves as associate editor of Contact Lens and Anterior Eye, and is an editorial board member for Optometry Vision Science, Clinical and Experimental Optometry and Eye and Contact Lens. He is a recipient of the Max Scapero Award from the Cornea, Contact Lenses and Refractive Technologies section of the American Academy of Optometry. He has been recognized by Contact Lens Spectrum, the major journal of contact lens, as one of the 30 most influential people in the field of contact lenses. Donc, ça, c'est la présentation du professeur Éric Papas. Le lien que j'ai avec Éric Papas, c'est que nous avons été ensemble à l'Université de Manchester dans les années 80. On était tous les deux étudiants en post-graduation. Et là, il y a quelques temps, j'ai repris contact avec lui et je l'ai simplement invité. Et après ça, il a donné son OK. C'était parce qu'il y a le décalage saisonnier entre si vous voulez, entre l'Australie et le Nord, et l'hémisphère Nord et l'hémisphère Sud. Donc, il m'a suggéré de le faire pendant le début de ses vacances, de ses grandes vacances, parce qu'en ce moment, c'est l'été en Australie. Donc, il m'a dit, en fait, OK, je le ferai, mais je le ferai au moment opportun. Donc, qu'est-ce qu'il va aborder? Il va aborder une chose qui va un petit peu nous bousculer dans nos certitudes. Il va nous parler de tout ce que parfois nous sommes enclins de diagnostiquer des sécheresses oculaires, et de là donc à aborder une approche parfois en contactologie ou une approche thérapeutique tenant compte du fait que la personne ait une sécheresse oculaire ou n'a pas de sécheresse oculaire. Dans son approche, il va un petit peu nous bousculer dans nos certitudes. Donc, je vais rappeler quelques termes qu'il va utiliser pour nos amis qui sont étudiants. Il va parler de la sensibilité et la spécificité d'un certain nombre de tests. Alors, la sensibilité et la spécificité décrivent mathématiquement la précision d'un test qui signale la présence ou l'absence d'une condition par rapport à un gold standard ou une définition. La sensibilité, c'est le taux de vrai positif, fait référence à la proportion de personnes atteintes de maladies, par exemple, lorsqu'elles sont jugées par le gold standard qui ont reçu un résultat positif à ce test. Alors, le test gold standard, il va être abordé, va être défini par le professeur Émérite Papas dans un petit moment. La spécificité, quant à elle, c'est le taux de vrai négatif qui fait référence à la proportion de ceux qui n'ont pas la condition, donc la pathologie, lorsqu'ils sont jugés par le gold standard et qui ont reçu un résultat négatif à ce test. Donc, I will try to introduce some terms. Professor Émérite Papas will talk about sensitivity and specificity of some tests, of some tier film tests who would qualify as person who is deficient or is not deficient in terms of tiers. So sensitivity and specificity mathematically describe the accuracy of a test which reports the presence of, or absence of a condition, of a pathology, if you want, in comparison to a gold standard or definition. I will introduce the definition of the sensitivity or true positive rate refers to the proportion of those who have the condition when judged by the gold standard that received a positive result on this test. Specificity, true negative rate refers to the proportion of those who don't have the condition, the pathology, but judged by the gold standard that received a negative result on this test. Donc, sans plus attendre, je vais laisser donc la professeure Émérite Papas nous introduire à cette thématique. Without any delay, I will introduce, I will let Professor Émérite Papas talk about his subject.
Hello, I'm Professor Émérite Papas from the Department of Optometry and Vision Science at the University of New South Wales in Sydney in Australia. It's an absolute pleasure for me to be able to talk to you tonight. And first of all, let me apologise for not being able to do that in person, but to do this by recording, because the timing of your meeting is unfortunately something like 3 o'clock in the morning for me. And that's a little bit past my usual bedtime these days. So I'm sorry not to be here live, but hopefully the recording will be just as good. If you do have questions of any sort that come up during the talk, please feel free to drop me an email. My email address is there at the bottom of this title slide, so feel free to use that and contact me with any questions that you do have. As I say, I'm very happy to be able to speak to you. I was very pleased when my very old friend Shaban asked me to do this. Shaban and I were fellow postgraduate students back at the University of Manchester a very long time ago. We used to play football together, which was a little bit embarrassing for both of us, but I fondly remember those days. So thank you to him for the invitation, and thank you to you for attending this session this evening. The topic of the talk is why you may not be as good at diagnosing dry eye as you think you are. And that might be a little bit confusing, so I hope as the talk goes on you'll understand where I'm coming from on this particular topic. Before I go any further, I just have one or two acknowledgements to make on the next slide. So just in terms of disclosure and acknowledgements, these companies are the ones that have funded me in recent past, so thanks to them for their support. But I should say that none of their products relate to the subject matter of this talk, so I don't have any conflicts of interest to declare with respect to that. I should say my video here in the corner will pop in and out from time to time during the talk, so you won't always have to look at my face during the presentation. So let's get on with the rest of the talk. So the talk really centres around a question that I have, which is really, what is the best test that we can use to diagnose dry eye? There's a range of tests available to us, and we'll talk about those in a little while. But really, what is the best test that we can use? So we're going to discuss that. We're going to try and establish what the best test is. And then we're going to think a little bit about how we can improve our chances of making a correct diagnosis with those tests, and perhaps how we can improve the ability of an individual test to make a correct diagnosis. So that's the format of the talk. As a starting point, then, let's think about the definition of dry eye. And this is a definition that's been provided by the Tear Film and Ocular Surface Society in their dry eye workshop recently. So the definition of dry eye that they produced, you can see on the right-hand side of the slide. And basically, dry eye is characterized as a multifactorial disease that has essentially 4 components. The first component is the presence of symptoms. So there's some kind of ocular discomfort. The second is tear film instability. So the tear film breaks up or evaporates or is in some way unstable. The third of these is hyperosmolarity. So the tear film, the salt content of the tear film becomes relatively higher, increasing the osmolarity of the tear film. And the fourth and final thing is the presence of some damage or an inflammation of the ocular surface. And so these 4 components of the definition imply to us that we can have 4 areas of testing to identify whether each of these components of the definition is present or absent. So the first thing we need is some means of testing for symptoms, and the classic way to do that are recommended to be the Ocular Surface Disease Index, the OSDI questionnaire, or the Dry Eye Questionnaire, the 5-item Dry Eye Questionnaire. So once we've established the presence of symptoms, we can then go and look for signs. And the kind of tests that we use in this situation are some kind of non-invasive breakup time test, a test for osmolarity. We need to use some kind of clinically available osmometer to establish the presence of increased osmolarity. And finally, we need to look for ocular surface staining, so staining with fluorescein or lissamine green. Once we've done that, we can combine the results of these tests to decide whether or not the person is positive for dry eye or negative for dry eye. So in making the diagnosis, we follow this simple equation. So the T-FOS-T report says we need to establish the presence of symptoms. And then on top of that, we have 1 or more positive signs. And those positive signs can be non-invasive breakup time, osmolarity, or ocular surface staining. If we have symptoms plus 1 of those things, then we generally conclude a diagnosis of dry eye. And just to remind you of the cutoff values for these individual subtests for symptoms, the recommended methods are either the Ocular Surface Disease Index, the OSDI questionnaire, and a cutoff score of greater than or equal to 13 is indicative of dry eye for that. Whereas the Dry Eye Questionnaire, 5-item Dry Eye Questionnaire, has a cutoff score of greater than or equal to 6. In terms of signs, the first one that we generally look for is a measure of tear film stability, and non-invasive breakup time is the recommended measure there. If you prefer to use fluorescein breakup time, that's also possible, and in fact the cutoff score is the same in both cases. It's a score of greater than 10 less than 10 would indicate a dry eye problem. In terms of osmolarity, a measure of both eyes is required, and a score of more than 308 milliosmoles per litre in either eye, or actually an interocular difference, so difference between the eyes, of greater than 8 milliosmoles per litre would indicate dry eye. In terms of staining of the ocular surface, we use fluorescein and lissamine green, and we're looking for staining of either the cornea, the conjunctiva, or in fact the lid margin area as well. And the recommendation is that greater than 5 spots on the cornea, 9 spots on the conjunctiva, or a length of longer than 2 millimeters or a width greater than 25% of the lid margin area. Width is indicative of dry eye. Having established what the available tests are that we can use, I think it's an interesting question to ask, and I'm going to ask you to think about this question, is what is the most useful test amongst the ones that are available to us? So if we think about the available options, then we have perhaps a symptoms questionnaire, a tear stability test, a test of osmolarity, a test of ocular surface staining, fluorescein lissamine green, or a tear production test. Which of those 5 alternatives do you think is going to be the most useful for testing dry eye? And in fact, if we were doing this live, I might ask you to just write in the chat box what you think the answer was. But because this is a recording, I'm going to show you what happened when I asked this question at the BCLA recently. So what's coming up next are the responses from the crowd at the BCLA. And here you can see on the right-hand side that more than half, nearly 60% of the audience thought that symptoms were the most useful test, followed by a non-invasive breakup time, a tear film stability test, and then quite a long way further back, osmolarity and corneal staining, with tear production being very much lower. So that's kind of an interesting view of what practitioners believe to be right now the most useful test. So it would be interesting for you guys to think about whether you agree with this or whether you have a different view. So that's all well and good, and we have these tests and we carry them out pretty routinely, and we make our diagnosis based on the findings that we have and the equation that I presented to you before. But the question that's been bothering me, or I've been worrying about, thinking about lately, is this one. So if you test positive for dry eye on these tests, how likely is it that you really do have dry eye at all? So this might seem a strange question because we do the tests and we get the answer and the person has dry eye. But actually, that situation is not quite as straightforward as it appears on face value. So let's think about what I mean by this. So typically when we give someone a test, we tend to consider that there are 2 outcomes. So we give the test to a person, and if they test positive on that test, then we say, okay, we'll start some treatment. On the other hand, if they test negative, we say, well, they don't have the disease, there's no treatment necessary, and we may send them home or perhaps monitor them carefully in the future. The problem with this simple 2-outcome view of testing is, of course, that no test is 100% accurate. And in fact, for all tests, there are more than 2 possible outcomes. So, as I say, there are more than 2 outcomes for any test. And in fact, for most tests, there are actually 4 potential outcomes. The first one is the one that we generally want, which is that the person actually does have the disease and the test comes out positive. So that would be a true positive result. The second, usually well understood outcome is the person doesn't have the disease. They do not actually have the disease, but the test returns a negative value. So that is a true negative outcome. So these 2 are the things that we generally understand. The other 2 possibilities, though, is that the person actually has the disease, but the test returns a negative outcome, so that would be a false negative, or that they don't have the disease, but the test returns a positive outcome, so that would be a false positive. Now, both the false positive and the false negative are undesirable because, of course, false positives can be expensive because it means that we may begin treatment for somebody that does not need to be treated. So that's a waste of everybody's time and effort and expenditure. And probably more concerning even than that is the false negative, which means that we don't treat a disease that actually exists. And depending on the disease condition that we're considering, that can obviously be quite dangerous. Undesirable things. So the question is really, what is the likelihood that a person who does return a positive test really does have dry eye? In other words, that it's a true positive result, as opposed to these other erroneous things, the false positives and false negatives, which reduce the accuracy of the clinical test. So answering this question depends a little bit on the behaviour of that test. And so we need to understand the true positive rate and the true negative rate. And these are sometimes called the sensitivity, true positive rate known as sensitivity, true negative rate known as specificity. And obviously the higher these two things are, the better, because the higher they are, then the lower the false negative and false positive rates. So if we can establish the true positive rate and the true negative rate, then we're in business. But is there anything else that we need to know in order to establish this question, which is how likely is it the person really does dry eye? Well, in fact, yes, there is. And the other thing that we need to know is this concept of prevalence. Prevalence is, as I'm sure you know, the proportion of a population that's affected by a given condition. So here we have, for example, 100 people, and if 20 of those people have a particular condition or disease, 20 out of 100, then the prevalence is 20%. So that's the concept of prevalence. So let's just think about why this is important to understanding the likelihood of having a disease or a condition. In this first, let's say that we again have this 100 people, and we're going to give them all a test, and it's a pretty good test. It has a true positive rate of 90%, and a true negative also 90%. And this is actually probably better than just about any test that we can conceivably use. But for this example, we're using a good test. So 90% true positive, 90% true negative. And let's assume that the prevalence of this particular disease in this population is 50%. So we give everybody in this group the test, and what happens? Well, 90% true negative rate, 90% true positive rate means that out of 50 people who actually do have the disease, 5 of them will be false negatives. So we'll miss 5 people that actually do have the disease. And likewise, in the group of people that actually don't have the disease, we'll have 5 false positives. So 5 people in this side of the group will actually not have the disease, but will test positive. So that's 10 people in this group who get a misdiagnosis. Let's consider the second scenario, which is using the same test, so a very good test, 90% positive rate, 90% true negative rate, but this time the disease prevalence is only 1%. So only one person in this 100-person group actually has the disease. Now, when we do this test with these people, because the true positive rate is 90%, the one person who actually does have the disease has a 1 in 10 chance that they will be missed. So 9 times in 10 they'll be caught, 1 time in 10 they'll be missed, and that's reasonably high. But also, we'll have 10 people this time who actually provide a false positive. So they don't have the disease, but they test positive with this particular test. So in that scenario, in fact, even with a very good test, with low prevalence, you could end up treating people, actually only treating people who don't have the disease. So you can see how prevalence affects the outcome of our clinical thinking when we're using even a good test. So returning to our question then, if a person has a positive test, how likely is it actually that they really do have dry eye? As we said, we need to know a number of things. We need to know the true positive rate, the true negative rate, and we've seen now also that we need to know the prevalence of the disease or condition. So what is the prevalence of dry eye disease? What we usually do when we need to answer a question like this, of course, is we go to the scientific literature. And when we do that, we find that this study here by Oliver Shine and co-workers was the first one to really give us a value for prevalence for dry eye. The problem, of course, is that since this study was published back in 1997, there have been a lot of other studies also publishing values for prevalence. In fact, there's well over 50 studies already in the literature which give prevalence values. And when we look through these studies, it becomes very obvious that a single number is very difficult to arrive at, because the answer that you get for prevalence depends on a number of things. It depends on where you do the study, whether that be in Europe or North America or Asia or in Australia, you get a different answer. The answer also depends on the sex of the participants, so men and women tend to be different in this respect, and also the age of the sample is very critical. Older people have different prevalence rates for dry eye than younger people. And finally, and really importantly, the diagnostic methods used during the study are very important. So if the study reports prevalence based only on the presence of symptoms, for example, we'll get a very different number than if the study reports prevalence based on the presence of signs. So the number that we arrive at is very difficult, in fact, to be certain about. So how do we arrive at a single number for prevalence that we can use in our calculations? The way we've been looking at to solve this problem is by using the work of this gentleman, Thomas Bayes. Thomas Bayes was an English clergyman in the 18th century, and he developed a way of thinking about information that allows us to combine things together. So let me give you a simple view of how thinking like Thomas Bayes can help us in dry eye. So what I want you to do is to imagine that there are two teams playing, let's say, football. It doesn't have to be football, it can be any game, but let's say we have two teams playing football today. One team wears red shirts and the other team wears blue shirts. And if I were to ask you, based only on that information, which team do you think would win today, you may have a view. And so on average, I guess that about half of you would say reds and half of you would say blues. In fact, when we asked the question at BCLA, we got a slight bias towards the red side, which is actually understandable because there is some research work which suggests that teams that play in red are actually a little bit more successful than teams that play in blue. So this slight bias towards the reds is quite understandable. But broadly speaking, it's roughly 50% red, 50% blue, and that's what you'd expect. So let's just change the question a little bit. It's the same situation. Team red is playing against team blue later today, but now I'm going to give you a little bit more information. So now I'm going to tell you that the last 10 times these two teams have played, the blue team has won 9 out of 10 of those games. This time, if I ask you who you think will win today, you may give a slightly different answer. And in fact, these are the numbers from the BCLA poll, and you can see that most people changed their view. Most people switched to believing that the blue team were going to be the winners. Okay, so let's just think about what happened. If you remember when we just had the information that the teams played in red and blue, roughly 50% of you thought the reds would win, 50% of you thought the blues would win. After giving you some more information, i.e. that the blues usually win, the general view changed a little bit to make it more likely that the blues would actually win. So what actually happened in these circumstances? Well, most of you changed your belief when you were given some new information. So the current belief was about 50-50. We gave you some new information which you combined with what you originally thought, and your new belief is actually that the blues are more likely to win. And actually, this is a manifestation of Bayes' rule. Bayes' rule says that you have an initial belief, and that initial belief is modified when you get new information, and it creates your new belief. And this isn't very surprising, I'm sure. Most of us use this kind of thinking in our daily lives. In fact, we call it learning. So most of us are actually Bayesians without knowing it. And of course, Thomas Bayes knew this, recognized this, and he just formalized it by expressing this rule and in a somewhat mathematical way. So how is this useful to us? Well, we can take all the studies that we have available to us, all the 55 studies, and using Bayes' rule, we can combine the information from those studies to give us a single estimate for the prevalence of dry eye. And the maths involved is fairly simple, but I'm not going to bother you with it right now. But anybody that's interested, it's contained in this paper that I published earlier this year. Anyway, the number of people involved when we do this, when we combine the information from all these studies, is about 2 million people. And when we do that, we arrive at a global prevalence for dry eye disease of about 11.6%. Well, that's all good, but there is a problem, and it's a fairly significant problem, which is that, as we've said before, this single estimate from all these papers combines information across all diagnostic criteria, all continents in the world, except for Antarctica, both sexes, and all ages. So it's very much an overall figure, and therefore it may not be very useful for our specific needs. So it's necessary to make an adjustment for that problem. So we need to adjust our estimate for dry eye based on the specific circumstances that are important to us at a particular time. Now, in terms of diagnostic criteria, the DUCE2 recommendation, which is symptoms plus a single sign, actually provides us very limited data. That probably is the one that we'd like to use, but there are very few studies, actually only a couple in a couple of regions, which give us information like this. So in Europe, the estimate based on the DUCE2 criteria is 26%, whereas in Western Asia, it's a little bit more, about 32%. But the data are really sparse. So because we actually have a lot more data from studies that were based on the presence of symptoms, I'm going to use that as the basis of the prevalence number for the rest of the calculations. And you can see here that the numbers vary quite a lot around the world, from a low of under 5% in North America to nearly 50% in Africa. And some of these studies actually don't have a lot of people in them, so are less reliable. But I'm going to use the number for Europe, which actually does involve quite a large number of people, quite a reasonable sample. It's also fairly similar to the prevalence in South America and in Oceania, in Australia, and it's not that dissimilar from the prevalence in Asia. So we're going to go with this number of 13.7% as the prevalence for dry eye in the rest of our calculations. Now we have our value for prevalence. We need to combine that with values for the sensitivity and specificity of each of our individual tests. And again, we have this problem of what value do we use? There are actually quite a lot of studies in the literature that report these values. So again, we need to combine these together to get it to a single value that we can use in our calculations. And once again, we can use Bayes' rule to do that. And in fact, there are 13 of these studies that report values for all the individual tests that we have. And using Bayes' rule in a similar way to the way we've just been discussing, we can combine those values to produce these numbers for sensitivity and specificity for each of our tests. As you can see, the best of these numbers is about 87%, which is less than the 90% that we used in our example earlier on. As I said, most tests don't return sensitivity and specificity values that are as good as 90%, and you can see that there's quite a lot of variation in the values that we get for the tests that we need to consider. Okay, so armed with these, we can use these and the prevalence values in our calculation, and so we can get on with that right now. So we have everything that we need to answer the question. Remember, the question is, if a person returns a positive test, how likely is it that they really do have dry eye? So we know now our sensitivity, our specificity, and our prevalence numbers. And again, actually, we can use Bayes' rule to help us answer this question. Again, I'm not going to bore you with the mathematics, but just let's get on with the answer. Okay, so what's the likelihood of having dry eye if a test is positive and that single test is symptoms? Well, with OSMI and DEQ5, it's pretty similar. So it's about 22, just under 23%. So let's think about that a little bit. So if you give somebody one of these questionnaires and you use the recommended cutoff, then there's only about a 1 in 4 chance that that person will actually have dry eye. So that's a little bit sobering, and it suggests to us that we need to be a little bit careful basing our responses purely on symptoms. What about the other tests? Well, they're all actually slightly better, except for one example, than symptoms alone. So osmolarity on its own is about a 1 in 3 chance. Non-invasive breakup time, slightly worse, but about the same. Corneal staining, again, about the same. Conjunctival staining a little bit less, and fluorescein breakup time significantly less at about 22%. But you can see that with any of these individual tests, the best of the tests has only a 1 in 3 chance of that person having dry eye if they're positive on the test. So that means that going through our 100 people, only a third of those people are likely actually to have dry eye if they test positive. And that's something for us to think about. Now, of course, the DUCE2 diagnostic criteria don't say you should rely on a single test. They say that you should have symptoms plus another sign. So let's look at the probabilities of actually having dry eye if we do that, if we satisfy the DUCE2 criteria. So here we're taking the probabilities if you base the diagnosis on the OSD or the DEQ5 plus one of the other tests. And now you can see the chances are better, but they're still not getting up to 50%. Again, osmolarity plus symptoms is about 48%. Non-invasive breakup time and corneal staining around about 45%. Conjunctival staining a bit less at 42%. And the fluorescein breakup time combined with symptoms about 34%. So still less than a 50% chance with the DUCE2 diagnostic criteria that any person testing positive has dry eye. So that's a little bit a sobering thought for us, because we go through these tests, we do these tests, and we treat these people for dry eye, but actually half of them may not actually have dry eye at all. So we are at risk of making a big clinical error and a big clinical mistake. Well, let's keep going with this. What happens if we do a multiple range of tests and we add more than one test to our symptoms? So here are the numbers when we add the symptoms plus 2 signs, and it's getting better, but you can see we're still only around a 3 in 4 chance. So if we're combining osmolarity and NIBUT, or osmolarity and corneal staining, or NITBUT and corneal staining, we're around about 70%. And these are what we might call the higher tech options, where we use some kind of technology to aid in our diagnosis. The low-tech approach, where we just rely on our traditional clinical techniques, fluorescein breakup time and corneal staining and symptoms, conjunctival staining and corneal staining and symptoms, they're really around 60% at best. So we do seem to get a bit of an advantage by using the technological approaches to diagnosing dry eye. But if we're not using those methods, we need to be aware that there's a reasonably, a non-trivial chance that some people that we're testing may not actually have dry eye at all. So 60% at best that they've got dry eye. Of course, we can keep going with this. We can combine even more signs with our symptoms score, and this is what happens if we actually put everything in there. So symptoms plus the 4 signs of osmolarity, non-invasive breakup time, corneal staining, and conjunctival staining, and now we've got a number that is a lot more comforting. So if we do all these tests, we're up around 95% chance. So what that suggests to us, obviously, is that the more tests we do, then the more confident we can be in our dry eye outcomes. So let's just take a step back and think about what we've found. So in terms of diagnosing dry eye, there's clearly a hierarchy of tests. And you might like to think back to what you thought at the beginning, and what were your key tests, what were your most important tests. And the data suggests that actually the hierarchy is osmolarity first, then non-invasive breakup time and corneal staining, followed by conjunctival staining, and finally symptoms and the fluorescein-based breakup tests are the least effective at predicting actually who does dry eye. But it's important to remember that no single test is actually very good at all. And if we combine tests like the TFOS criteria says, but actually the more tests we put into this diagnostic mix, the better, then we'll get a better chance of finding out what we need to know. So as Dolly Poynton said, less is not more in terms of diagnosing dry eye, more is more. So perhaps that's been a little bit scary, talking about the lack of diagnostic accuracy from some of these tests. So I want to spend the next few minutes talking about how we can actually improve the chances of making a correct diagnosis. Obviously, from what we've seen, we're going to carry out a range of tests, and we found out that adding more tests together gives us a better chance of being successful. But what about the individual tests in the battery of tests that we give to an individual patient? How can we improve the ability of each individual test to do a good job of diagnosis? Well, let's start with the symptoms questionnaires that we use. And just to remind you, the cutoff score for the OSD questionnaire is a score of 12, whereas the dry eye questionnaire, the 5-item questionnaire, is a score greater than 5. The thing is with both these instruments that just because you score highly on these symptoms questionnaires, it may not necessarily mean that you actually have dry eye. There are other things which can raise these symptom scores which are not related to dry eye, but will nevertheless give us a high score. Let's look at a couple of possibilities. So vision is one of these things. We found out a number of years ago that if you blur people's vision slightly, then their comfort score reduces. You can see this chart on the left-hand side, where we actually just introduced small amounts of blur to people's vision, just with spectacle trial lenses. And you can see that with a half diopter of blur, we get a significant reduction in the comfort score of the people in this study. And this effect has been confirmed by a number of people since this initial finding, most notably by Subba Rao in a very neat experiment in Canada, and most recently by Carol Maldonado-Cadena, who's shown, as you can see here, that as visual quality improves, so also does the comfort score that people report. So there is this nice relationship between the quality of vision and the amount of visual comfort that people report. And of course, this has got nothing necessarily to do with dry eye. Somewhat related to this is a situation which was the topic of a recent PhD graduate of mine, Daniel Tillier, and this is his work. And Danny showed that, in fact, the OSD scores will be higher if you have a coexisting binocular vision problem. And that can be any of the things listed here. But you can see from the data on the right, these are contact lens data, but the same thing applies in general. If you have a binocular vision disorder, that's the grey bars, then your comfort scores are worse than if you don't. And that is a general finding. So it's really important to get rid of or to consider, when you get a high comfort score, whether there's an underlying condition. For example, does the person have heterophoria or some accommodative disorder or convergence insufficiency, something of this nature, which is causing their score to be higher than it should be, and actually, again, is nothing to do with dry eye. So when we're using these questionnaire type instruments, we need to remember that what they do is, mentally, is they combine input from multiple sources. And that can be from ocular surface problems, or it can be vision, binocular status, or even things like the mental health status of the individual. We know that mental health problems generally cause these scores to be higher than for people that have good mental health. And also things like medications. Of course, people may be taking medications for a variety of reasons, and many of those medications, whether they're topical or not, can precipitate symptoms which cause these instruments to increase their scores, but again have nothing to do with dry eye. So when we're using these things, we need to be aware that there is this risk of false positives for dry eye based on the underlying cause of the problem. So it's important during evaluation, during examination, to rule out any other possible problems before ascribing the score on the DQ5 or the OSD solely and only to dry eye. So thorough examination is very important, identifying those comorbidities that might be confounding the comfort score, and actually treating those conditions to make sure that we're not treating dry eye erroneously when we should be treating things like binocular vision disorders. Okay, what's next? Well, let's think about osmolarity. Remember we said that the diagnostic criteria for osmolarity was greater than 308 milliosmoles per litre in either eye, or an interocular difference of 8 milliosmoles per litre. Now, again, this is some work conducted by a postgraduate student of mine, this time Azadeh Tabakoli. And what Azadeh did was to worry about the consistency of diagnosis between the repeated measures of osmolarity. Most of the time, we just do a single measure of osmolarity on either eye, and we, as the TFOS criteria says, we make our diagnostic criteria based on that. But what Azadeh did was she basically measured both eyes twice. And she had 28 people, and she asked the question, how many of those people will be diagnosed with dry eye, according to the TFOS criteria, on each of those 2 repeats? And she compared the numbers of people who tested positive on each of those 2 repeats. So here's her answer. The first repeat at the top left-hand box, 54% were diagnosed as dry eye, and 46% were dry eye negative. And on the second repeat, show exactly the same numbers, 54 dry eye positive and 46% dry eye negative. So that seems all good and well. It looks like a very good outcome, exactly the same on both repeats. The problem is, unfortunately, that the number of people who tested positive on the first repeat, while numerically the same as on the second repeat, it's not necessarily the same people. So you can see here in the middle box, we're identifying those people whose diagnosis was consistent between the 2 repeats. So only 29% of people were consistently diagnosed on the first and second repeats with dry eye, and only 21% were consistently diagnosed as not having dry eye on both repeats. Those 2 numbers add up to 50%, and that means, in fact, that 50% also changed between the first and second repeats. That's slightly concerning. So 50% of diagnosis changed when the measurement was repeated. So what does that mean for us clinically, and what is the reason for this? Well, the reason is that commercial osmometers are not that repeatable. So when we actually measure the value, the repeatability value, between repeated measures, we get a number of about 25 milliosmoles. What that means is that if you take 2 consecutive measures on the same eye, just at random, that value can differ by as much as plus or minus 25 milliosmoles. And that means the diagnostic decision that we make can be critically affected by this change between repeats. But of course, we don't typically repeat measures of dry eye. We typically do a single measure on both eyes, and we make our decision on that. It turns out that if we did do a second measure, we might get an answer that differs from the first measure. So making a single measurement of dry eye is unreliable, particularly with respect to the 8 milliosmol interocular criteria. So for osmolarity, with the current guidelines and equipment, if you are only measuring one eye, then half the time, or half of those diagnostic decisions will be uncertain. And the problem is you don't know which ones they are. So you make a decision and it could be completely incorrect. So the answer to this is to do multiple measurements, and we really should be measuring osmolarity at least twice, and preferably 3 times. And of course, there's a cost issue here. The manufacturers tend not to make these instruments particularly affordable, and so it would be great if we had cheaper and more cost-effective methods of doing this. Other things to think about when you're doing osmolarity is where you put the probe. It's very important to put the probe in the same sort of position every time, particularly with the same person, because tear film is a very dynamic situation. So try and place the probe carefully each particular time. And also think about timing. The time of day when you do this, repeating the measures on the same person at the same time of day is critical to getting a reliable outcome. So there are issues with osmolarity, as I've said. When it works, it can be a very useful test, but getting it to work effectively and properly is really a question, like many measurements, of making repeated evaluations. Next, we have ocular surface staining with fluorescein, lissamine green. Remember, we're looking for greater than 5 spots or greater than 9 spots with on the conjunctiva or lid margin. Ocular surface staining is again something that can have causes other than dry eye. If you look at these two pictures at the top, both these pictures would be staining positive in terms of the criteria that we've talked about before. But do they indicate that the person actually has dry eye? Well, in fact, they don't. The left one is mucin ball depressions on somebody wearing a contact lens, soft contact lens. And the right one is actually solution-induced staining. So neither of these would be treatable as dry eye. What about other things? Well, of course, when I worked in the West End of London, people used to come to the practice generally on the tube, on the underground, and quite often those people would have corneal staining due to the amount of dust and debris in the air during their journey. So, you know, those kind of things can be confounding. And there are many other causes of staining, as I'm sure you know: infection, toxicity, contact lens wear itself, environment, medications, all these kind of things. In terms of ocular surface staining, it's important not to confuse things which are normal. For example, Marx's line, this line here, the boundary between the mucocutaneous junction on the eyelid, will stain with lissamine green, but that's not diagnostic for dry eye. It may look to satisfy the criteria, but of course it's a normal finding. So we need to be sure that our staining relates to dry eye and not something else. So eliminating all these other things when we're evaluating ocular surface staining is very important. The other thing here is that it's probably important then to repeat the measurement. So if somebody comes in with staining, think about, could it be just a transient thing that they have? Maybe think about bringing them back in and repeating that assessment and adding staining outcomes together. So corneal staining combined with conjunctival staining gives us a better outcome than either individually as well. So as we said before, adding these tests together is much more helpful than looking at them individually. And finally, let's think about breakup time. Of course, non-invasive breakup time is the gold standard here, but many people don't use those instruments. And of course, it is possible to use a slit lamp and the proper illumination to do a non-invasive breakup time. Here you can see an example of an obvious break in the tear film, which is observable without using these flash techniques. But of course, the reliability of these methods is slightly worse. So we do need to make sure that we repeat these measures several times to give us a more reliable answer. And in fact, the automated systems do offer greater reliability, and that's reflected in their greater diagnostic accuracy. We can, of course, use fluorescein, and again, we need to repeat that measure. And it's interesting that when we're using fluorescein, there's a couple of things about the way fluorescein behaves, which we can, if we're aware of, we can improve our diagnostic abilities. For example, when we instill fluorescein, if we put too much in, there's a problem that it might demonstrate this phenomenon called quenching. So basically, quenching says that if the concentration of fluorescein is too high, it will not fluoresce as strongly as when the concentration is lower. And that's reflected here in this example where we followed the time course of fluorescence intensity. And you can see it brightens a little bit during the first minute. So you might want to wait, 30, 40, 60 seconds after you instill fluorescein to make sure you get the maximum brightness. And then likewise, you might want to finish your evaluation within about 5 minutes before it begins to fade away again. So doing these things can increase our ability to be diagnostically correct when we're using fluorescein to do a breakup time. So just summing all this up for you, just because something sounds like a duck doesn't mean it is a duck, and it's the same with corneal stain, with dry eye diagnosis. So there are things which may appear to be diagnostically sensible for dry eye, but they don't necessarily mean that person has dry eye. And it's our job to take all the information into account and make a decision based on that. So we need to not only listen to a duck, make sure it's quacking, we need to have a good look at it and make sure it actually looks like a duck, and that it walks like a duck, and it swims like a duck, before we actually say it is a duck. And that's the same with dry eye. It needs to be, it needs to tick all the boxes for us in diagnosis. So when a person comes in and reports a problem that sounds like it might be dry eye, we need to conduct a comprehensive examination that doesn't just focus on the dry eye aspects of the case. We need to carry out a range of appropriate tests, and I hope I've given you some awareness of how fallible some of these tests can be. And so not to rely on single tests alone, but to combine the information from multiple tests and as many tests as possible. It's probably important to do follow-up tests, so don't just test on a single occasion, test on a separate occasion to make sure that the outcomes are confirmed. And again, combine all the outcomes from these different tests. Think about differential diagnosis. So some of these things that are flagging as positive for dry eye may have other causes, binocular vision issues, health problems, all these kind of things. And so we need to eliminate those things from our diagnostic thinking before we decide on a treatment. And that treatment needs to be relevant. If it's not dry eye, then you treat the problem. If it is dry eye, fair enough, you treat the dry eye. But don't just treat dry eye when it could be something else. And by doing this, we can probably reduce the number of unnecessary prescriptions that we dispense and increase the efficacy and quality of our consultations. Just before finishing, there's a couple of cautionary words that I need to say. The first is that prevalence is a very variable number. We've talked about this earlier on in the presentation, but the value of prevalence that you use in these calculations affects the outcome. And basically, the higher the prevalence of the dry eye disease that you consider is relevant to you, then the better your chance of having a correct diagnosis. So when prevalence is very low, such as in these bottom sets, you will get a much lower chance of being correct than when prevalence is very high. And you remember the number that we used was this number of 13.7%, which is actually a European value. For you guys in North Africa, then the number may well be different. The number that we have for Africa is actually quite a lot higher, nearly 50%, but that's actually based on studies that were conducted in Ghana and in South Africa. So what the numbers are in North Africa, I really don't know, and you guys probably have a better idea of that than I do. So if you believe that the prevalence of dry eye is significantly higher than this 13%, then you're probably going to do better than the numbers that I've presented to you tonight. The second thing I should say is that there's currently no gold standard test for diagnosing dry eye. So we don't have a very reliable test that we can use. And therefore, there's a certain amount of uncertainty involved with all this diagnostic calculation, because we really don't know the true answer. Well, I hope that's been an interesting and useful few minutes listening to this presentation. What I hope has happened is that when you began this talk, however good you thought you were at dry eye, then listening to this talk has improved your ability to diagnose dry eye, and so that now you really are quite good at it. So this exercise in Bayesian thinking, I hope, has been useful for you. And if it has been, then thanks very much for listening, and greetings from Sydney, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. As I say, if you do have questions, please drop them in my email address, and I'll be happy to try and answer them for you. But for now, thanks very much, and good evening.
Alors, il a bousculé un petit peu nos certitudes, n'est-ce pas, mes amis? Donc, la chose qui est évidente, c'est que les tests que nous utilisons ont des spécificités, des sensibilités qui diffèrent. Et par votre conséquence, à chaque fois que nous utilisons ces tests-là, nous sommes obligés de nous poser la question, est-ce que ce que nous constatons est vrai ou pas? Et par la suite, si on multiplie les tests, vous avez vu, on réduit la marge d'erreur. C'est un petit peu le message que voulait nous passer professeur Émérite Papas, en premier lieu. En deuxième lieu, il a bousculé aussi notre certitude sur les gold standard tests. Parce que pendant longtemps, je pense que probablement que mon ami René est un petit peu de mon avis. Pendant longtemps, on s'était basé dans le temps sur le test Schirmer, qui est un test quantitatif. Bien avant. C'était un petit peu pour poser le pour et le contre. Est-ce que nous sommes, en essayant de prendre des mesures, nous ne provoquons pas des réactions qui ne reflètent pas la réalité de l'état lacrymal de l'individu? Ensuite, bien sûr, il y a eu beaucoup de développement, beaucoup de tests qui sont accumulés. Aujourd'hui, professeur Émérite Papas nous a cité l'essentiel des tests. Il y a d'autres tests qui n'ont pas été cités. En combinant tous ces tests, on réduit la marge d'erreur. Ensuite, on a vu cet exemple du canard. Ce n'est pas parce que ça ressemble à un canard que c'est un canard. Il faut nécessairement que ce n'est pas parce que ça fait un son comme un canard que c'est un canard. Il faut constater que réellement c'est un canard. Ça nous pose un problème réel parce que parfois nous passons à côté de diagnostic de sécheresse oculaire et parfois par excès, nous dépistons beaucoup plus de déficients, notamment quand on est dans le domaine de la contactologie, on est enclin à chaque fois qu'il y a un inconfort, à penser à une indisponibilité du film lacrymal, une déficience ou une anomalie du film lacrymal. Donc, cela étant dit, j'ouvre un peu le débat. Le professeur Émérite Papas a laissé son email. Il souhaiterait qu'on lui fasse part de notre point de vue. S'il y a des questions à poser, on lui posera des questions. Mais parce qu'il est absent, je pense que c'est important d'ouvrir un petit peu le débat avec les gens qui sont présents. Tout à l'heure, j'ai vu René en train de hocher sa tête. Je lui cède la parole. C'est bon, René.
Merci, oui. C'était très intéressant parce qu'on a une approche, comment dire, très scientifique, comment dire, du diagnostic de l'œil sec, en tenant compte notamment de la prévalence. Donc ça, c'est vraiment quelque chose qui est important et franchement, je ne pensais pas que ça jouait à ce point-là. Donc ça, c'est très, très bien. Après, ce qui concerne les tests, je n'ai pas opiné de la tête, au contraire, j'ai fait le signe non comme ça quand tu as parlé du Schirmer, parce que le Schirmer, franchement, je n'y ai jamais cru. Je l'ai essayé sous ces deux formes.
On a un souci avec le... On a un souci. On n'entend pas bien. Vous voulez prendre...
Ah, je ne sais pas quoi faire.
Essayez de reprendre...
J'ai une mauvaise liaison.
Essayez de reprendre le dernier passage. Donc, vous n'y avez jamais cru au test Schirmer?
Oui, donc je disais que je n'y croyais pas trop. Je n'ai jamais cru au Schirmer et ce n'est pas faute de l'avoir essayé cliniquement. Et avec ou sans anesthésiste. Schirmer 1.
Non,
Ça n'a jamais été très probant et j'ai toujours lutté contre ça, y compris encore récemment en discutant avec des spécialistes de la vision, optométristes et surtout ophtalmologistes, qui disaient non, mais moi je me sers toujours du Schirmer, j'estime que ça me reste et je n'ai pas, bien sûr, nous avons utilisé le Breakup Time, mais on a eu la chance également, étant proche donc du père du tierscope, je cite Jean-Pierre Guillon, qui est un camarade de promotion. Alors, moi, je n'ai pas joué au football avec lui, mais au basketball. Et donc, comment dire, je l'ai vu faire ses travaux en Angleterre. Puis après, donc, on a bénéficié de ses travaux avec l'appareil, avec le tierscope. Et donc, du coup, on a travaillé avec le tierscope et dit d'une autre manière, on a appris à faire, si l'on veut, enfin ce qu'on appelle donc le NIBUT, c'est-à-dire le break-up time non invasif. Ça, on a compris très rapidement que c'était la bonne solution. Donc, du coup, cliniquement, moi, j'estime que, comment dire, on a été dans une bonne approche, qui est une approche clinique.
Oula, ça ne passe pas bien.
Au niveau de la cornée, soit au niveau donc de la conjonctive. Donc,
On a des coupures, René, hein? On a des coupures. Je pense que la connexion n'est pas bonne.
je sais que les ondes n'est pas.
La connexion n'est pas tellement bonne. René?
Ouais, je sais pas, je peux rien faire. Oui, allô?
Oui, oui, la connexion n'est pas bonne, hein? Reprenez le dernier passage. Vous parliez de votre expérience avec Michel Guillon et sur le.
Alors,
Allez-y.
alors j'ai parlé de.
Oh là là,
Et puis, bien sûr, et parallèlement à ça, on a toujours pratiqué l'observation donc des piquetés, ce qu'en anglais on appelle les stenings, donc les piquetés cornéens et conjonctivaux. Et puis également, alors là, nous sommes sans doute beaucoup moins nombreux, mais moi je l'ai fait. J'ai travaillé pendant un certain temps et j'ai toujours après regardé.
Ça coupe, hein? Ça coupe énormément.
Très intéressant. Par...
Ça coupe, hein? Je ne sais pas si tu arrives à m'entendre là correctement parce que de ton côté, c'est un peu difficile d'entendre. Est-ce que c'est le cas des autres? Je ne sais pas. Aucune
Bien
idée.
sûr, oui. Oui. Bon, je vais essayer de reprendre. Et donc, je parlais également de l'observation de la ligne de marche. Je disais que nous sommes sans doute peu à l'avoir utilisée, mais moi, je l'utilise et depuis très longtemps. Et puis, je l'enseigne également aux étudiants parce que c'est quelque chose de très facile d'accès dans la mesure où on a utilisé la fluorescence du verre un tout petit peu la peau et on voit donc le bord libre.
Ouais, ça coince. Ça coince encore une fois, René. Je ne sais pas ce qui se passe, mais là, on a perdu René. Un petit moment, on va attendre, on va patienter. Je ne sais pas s'il y a d'autres intervenants qui veulent poser des questions ou bien qui veulent faire des commentaires. René, ça bloque, hein? Bon, de toutes les façons, je vais essayer un petit peu de faire la synthèse des choses et puis par la suite, bien sûr, on aura à revoir professeur Éric Papas le 3 février. Entre-temps, si vous avez des questions, n'hésitez pas à les lui poser. La présentation a été insérée dans la rubrique fichier de la page du groupe FCO. Vous allez trouver toutes les planches que vous avez vues. Elle va être disponible, cette vidéo, je l'espère, d'ici demain. Elle va être disponible sur la chaîne YouTube. Donc, ça va être disponible sur la chaîne YouTube, Shaban Fethi. C'est une chaîne où je mets tous les webinaires, donc vous pouvez la retrouver. Elle va être aussi, un lien sera mis sur la page du groupe. Donc, sans plus attendre, je pense que c'était très bénéfique. On remercie donc Professor Eric Papas. Donc, we thank a lot Professor Eric Papas. We hope that we'll see him next time on the 3rd of February 2022. Meanwhile, I have asked all the participants to send questions if they would like to the address of Professor Eric Papas. Donc, nous allons avoir la semaine prochaine des experts. Alors là, je souligne des experts dans le contrôle de la myopie. On aura Dr Thomas Haller. Dr Thomas Haller, c'est un pionnier du contrôle de la myopie. Il a plusieurs patents, plusieurs brevets concernant des méthodes pour ralentir la progression de la myopie. On aura Professeur Marc Billimore qui a déjà intervenu il y a quelque temps sur dans les webinaires de notre groupe l'année passée. On va le réavoir certainement cette année. On va voir Professeur Langis Michaud de l'Université de Montréal, un autre expert dans le contrôle de la myopie, avec beaucoup de travaux menés au niveau de sa clinique, la clinique de l'Université de Montréal, la clinique du département d'Optometry. On aura aussi, je l'espère, Professeur Jean-Paul Fabre. C'est un spécialiste du contrôle de la myopie. Il a travaillé énormément sur les lentilles multifocales. Ensuite, il a développé la fameuse lentille DRL pour l'orthokératologie. Il va nous parler, si vous voulez, du contrôle de la myopie avec l'histoire si vous voulez, de la variation de la zone de traitement pour obtenir des résultats optimaux. Donc, ça va être très intéressant. Ça va être vers le 15 février. Le 15 février, donc on l'aura. Nous allons voir aussi Dr Marie-J. Cillier qui interviendra à partir d'Afrique du Sud le 27 janvier. Elle va aussi nous permettre d'avoir une meilleure compréhension de la surface oculaire, des pathologies de la surface oculaire et de la manière dont elles sont prises en charge. Donc, j'espère que ces sessions seront bénéfiques pour tout un chacun. Et d'ici la semaine prochaine, je vous souhaite bonne continuation. Prenez soin de vous, faites attention. Le virus reste présent. Il a impacté notre manière de vivre, notre manière de travailler, notre manière de réfléchir. Donc, abstenez-vous de prendre beaucoup de risques. Keep safe. J'espère que vous avez bénéficié de cette belle présentation, très belle présentation, très instructive du professeur Eric Papas. Je vous souhaite donc bonne fin de soirée et au revoir.